When it was introduced in 1985, the Oldsmobile 98 Regency was a pretty revolutionary car for General Motors. Not only did it have a transversely mounted front-wheel drive engine and transmission, but the vehicle had quite a bit of technology in it as well, including four-wheel independent suspension and sequential multi-port fuel injection, along with electronic ignition. Unfortunately, the 98 that was introduced to the public in 1985 would suffer its fair share of teething problems, everything from the 440 T4 transmission to power steering racks experiencing what was called morning sickness at the time, or being hard to turn the wheel left to right, especially when the car was cold, broken window regulators, temperamental window switches. By the time 1990 rolled around, General Motors had finally gotten the C-bodies just about right. And by this point, despite what anyone says, I would say that General Motors' quality in the late 80s and early 90s was actually pretty good. It was certainly much better than it was even just a few years before. What we're going to examine today here is a 1990 Oldsmobile 98 Touring Sedan, a rare bird if there ever was one in the Oldsmobile lineup. Most buyers of the 98 were really looking for luxury, but for whatever reason, General Motors product planners thought that there was a market for a touring sedan based on the 98, and that was not unique on the C-bodies. Cadillac did something similar with the DeVille. They had a DeVille touring sedan, and of course, Buick had the Electra T-Type. But the Olds 98 touring sedan was introduced for the 1987 model year as option code W12. It wasn't a full model in that 1987 model year, but it did have its own VIN and a V trim code. Those first Olds 98 touring sedans were most identifiable by their unique wheels as well as the lack of chrome and stainless trim around the daylight openings on the vehicles, giving it a more sinister look, shall we say. And the polished stainless trim at the bottom of the doors on the Olds 98 was replaced with this kind of ribbed design in a gray color that was very en vogue at the time. A number of GM vehicles had similar designs. The Pontiac Grand Am, as an example, was the first Pontiac to really embrace that rib styling. The Cimarron had it, and other Cadillacs like the 1986 Seville, and it was really patterned off of a Mercedes styling theme from many years prior. In any case, by 1990, the touring sedan had really evolved, and by that point, Oldsmobile had sold quite a few touring sedans, about 4,000 in 1987, 8,000 in 1988, another 7,000 in 1989, and it would go on to sell about 5,500 in 1990. When a buyer selected the touring sedan, there was a fair amount of equipment that was added to the vehicle. Most notably, it was the touring sedan, so it had to handle well, and the cars got what Oldsmobile called its FE3 touring car ride and handling components. This was basically stiffer springs, shocks, larger anti-roll bars to make the car handle better. And it truthfully did work quite well. The car also got 16-inch aluminum wheels as well as faster steering on these touring sedans. And those wheels were not only good looking, but Oldsmobile at least said that they were functional too. Being aluminum, they helped reduce the unsprung weight and help dissipate the heat from the brakes, whether that was on the front or the rear. The cars also came equipped with four-wheel anti-lock brakes, as well as GM's venerable 3800 V6 underhood that made 165 horsepower, and by this point, the 3800 was really perfected. These are some of the most durable Buick 3800 engines that were ever made, and they could easily go several 100,000 miles if properly maintained. Let's take a look around this particular Olds 98 touring sedan and discuss some of the strange features, quirks, and idiosyncrasies of it. Now, as we look at the side profile of this Oldsmobile 98 touring sedan, you notice some of the things that I mentioned, including the lack of chrome and stainless trim around the daylight opening, as well as the 16-inch wheels and the lower body cladding with the ribs in it that was, well, in vogue for the time, as I said before. There's also not a stand-up hood ornament on the touring sedan. There's this lay-flat cloisonne style emblem on the hood that's tasteful and sporty. And you also got fog lights with the 98 touring sedan and these gray-colored mirrors. Here's a better look at the dead-on front angle, and you can see that lay-flat cloisonne emblem on the hood as well as the fog lights. And for 1990, the 12-slot grille had this gray color to it, I guess accenting whatever paint color you chose on your Olds 98. And now rotating around to the rear three-quarter view on this Olds 98 Touring Sedan, you notice a few things. One is that vertical C-pillar that was very in vogue for General Motors styling at the time. Remember, this car came out 4 model years after the 86 Taurus and Sable, and think about what an anachronism this looks like compared to that vehicle. But it still looks tasteful, and General Motors was big into this vertical C-pillar really because of the success of the 1976 to 79 Cadillac Seville, and they wanted that to trickle down throughout the lineup. This car also has a very low belt line. Look at how big the door glass is. And you can't quite see it in this picture, but that belt line is below the hood line, which was a very typical General Motors trend of the time. And the belt line is also below the backlight where it terminates at the bottom. Again, a very typical General Motors design characteristic of the era. The car has rather muted fender flares as compared to, say, the 1966 Tornado, and you can also see that ribbed cladding at the bottom. This car in particular has some overly smoked taillights that the owner must have added as opposed to the regular taillights. So those are not stock. But you did have the vertical taillights, which was a design theme that started on the Olds 98s back in the 1963 model year, when the vertical taillights were really a continuation of the sheet metal form. And that, I think, is one of the most beautiful Olds 98s, at least from the rear three-quarter view. That 63 Olds 98, though, is what started this vertical taillight theme for Oldsmobile that continued to carry on all the way through to the last 98s. And it really was a copy of Cadillac styling themes, but worked well for Oldsmobile. And I drive my 86 98 around, which has these vertical taillights, and I can't tell you how many people say, wow, what a nice Cadillac, and I have to correct them and say it's an Oldsmobile. And of course, no special edition Oldsmobile would be complete without its own cloisonne style emblem. And you see this one here on the C-pillar. That is the Ransom E. Olds crest in the middle of the badge there. That crest was also displayed on the regular 98 Regency. Here it's just in the center of this badge, and it says Touring Sedan around the perimeter. Let's now turn to the interior of the Touring Sedan, because this is a special place for sure. First thing you notice are these bucket seats. They were made by Lear Siegler, and I believe they're 18-way power seats that have everything from lumbar adjustments to articulating headrests. That's power articulating headrests, by the way. You'll also notice that you got some steering wheel controls in the Olds 98 Touring Sedan. Oldsmobile was a bit more restrained in its steering wheel controls compared to Pontiac that had quite a few buttons on the steering wheel. So this was a more restrained design, but effective nonetheless. Also notice the horseshoe shifter there, the only one that was employed in the C bodies, and there's a coin holder behind the horseshoe shifter. There's also a little thumb wheel that you can spin the coin holder and it becomes a very flimsy cup holder. You'll see that in more detail in a second. Importantly, you also have analog gauges, a speedometer on the left, tachometer on the right, and a full complement of fuel, oil pressure, temperature gauge, voltmeter, etc. And you've got real burl wood trim on the instrument panel here for the Olds 98 Touring Sedan as well as the console. That is real wood, and it is actually beautiful in this particular car. Notice on the door panel that you have the seat belts mounted into the doors. This was a GM design of the period that was soon sunset because, of course, if you get in a crash and the door opens, now you're no longer belted. But the idea was that you could keep these belts snapped at all times and buckled, and you'd open the door, pick up the belt, sit down, and you never had to unbuckle the seat belt. It really did not work at all. It was a lousy design, and like I said, it was only around for a few model years before General Motors realized that it was actually detrimental to safety of passengers and drivers alike. Here's a view from the passenger seat of this Olds 98 Touring Sedan. Notice the Ransom E. Olds crest there above the glove box, and you can really get a sense for how beautiful this burl wood is on the interior. It really is stunning in person, I have to say. And of course, this was the era in which high tech was in vogue, so the stereo has to have a ton of buttons, as you see on it, as does the HVAC control. This car has automatic climate control, and then above the automatic climate control is the trip computer. You got a little trip computer on this that would tell you miles to empty, average miles per gallon, instant fuel economy, time to your destination, and many other features. So that was kind of neat, but a little bit gimmicky, I would say, as well. Here's a look at some of the shared seat controls on the center console. This is just aft of the coin holder, and you can see that little thumb wheel for the coin holder that I was talking about there on the right. But these are shared controls that allow you to adjust the lumbar supports, the lateral support, the articulating headrest, and the thigh support on the seats. Again, these were 18-way power seats. You can move them in so many directions, and they really are great and gave this 98 Touring Sedan a very special feel. Notice the Oldsmobile tagline I just used. I mentioned that coin holder could be flipped into a cup holder, and here you see it. You just rotate that thumb wheel, and the coin holder changes to a cup holder. Well, this is a pretty flimsy cup holder. You're not going to be putting any cup in here and then starting to drive around. This is really only for use while you're stationary. Cup holders had not become in vogue yet in vehicles because cars were for driving, not for eating and drinking at this point. And one could argue that they never really should be for eating and drinking, but that's what people seemingly do in their cars today. But here's the cup holder in this Olds 98 Regency. And while the front seats were great in the Olds 98 Touring Sedan, so were the rear seats. You can see here they're quite comfortable. You have shoulder belts in the outer positions, which was starting to become the norm, but this was a bit early for that in 1990. So Oldsmobile was thinking of safety, and you got not only a comfortable place to sit, but one in which you were relatively safe as well. And here we have a shot under hood, and some of the most reliable components of this vehicle are under hood, namely the 3800 Series V6, which was making 165 horsepower and 210 pound-feet of torque in 1990. This is the pre-Series 1 3800. Excellent engine. That's all I can say about it. It's basically flawless, smooth, quiet. Unfortunately, some of the Buff Book magazines just really didn't like it because it wasn't double overhead cam and didn't rev all that high. But unfortunately, GM replaced this 3800 engine with a much more troublesome 3.6-liter V6, or one could at least argue was more troublesome. This 3800 was just bulletproof, smooth, reliable. And yeah, it didn't rev to 8,000 RPM or something like that, but so what? It delivered its power very smoothly and with very linear delivery. Great torque off the line, great mid-range punch that you would use around the city or to squirt in between traffic. Just an all-around great engine. And by this point, GM had really perfected the 4-speed automatic transmission. They're quite reliable by this point as well, certainly much more reliable than they were when introduced in 1985. And they had electronic controls for shift points as well as the lockup. So they were pretty robust, I would say, by this point. I will say, though, the least reliable component under the hood, or at least reliable in this day and age, is that combined brake booster master cylinder assembly there for the anti-lock brake system. These are just, I believe, really hard to replace and repair. And as I said, it's a integrated booster as well as ABS system. So if it ends up malfunctioning, you don't have power brakes. And that is one of the reasons why I honestly am not seeking one of these cars, because I've heard trying to find replacement components for those booster master cylinder combined assemblies or rebuilt units is really hard, if not very expensive. And it's also, I believe, difficult to convert them to a standard vacuum brake booster. But if you have an alternate opinion, please put it in the comments section, because I'd like to know about it. But from my perspective and what I hear, that's the most challenging element of these. I've owned some cars with this setup. It's fine when it's working. The pedal feel is a little bit funky, I would say, compared to the normal vacuum brakes, but it works. And I didn't have any trouble with mine. But now these systems are getting to be, 33 years old. That's quite some age on them. I would recommend, though, that if you have one, you change your brake fluid rather frequently and bleed out the brakes with new fluid, just to make sure that you're not putting any undue or excess moisture in the brake system. Well, I hope you enjoyed that quick look at this 1990 Olds 98 Touring Sedan. And if you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me what you thought of it. Put a comment in the comments section. Until next time, thanks again for watching and take care.